And the strained relationship with the stepfather, there was always a sense of distance between me and my stepfather, an invisible wall that neither of us could break through. No matter how many years passed, it wasn't that he had ever been outright cruel to me, but it was as though he had drawn a line around himself, a line that I was never allowed to cross. In the early days of their marriage, I had tried so hard to be accepted, to fit into the family in a way that made sense to me. I remember the first time he smiled at me, an awkward, forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I was only 10 then, but even at that age, I could feel something missing, something essential that could never be rebuilt. He wasn't my father, and I knew it. The role he had come to play was one of necessity, not affection. My mother had remarried after my father's absence from my life, and it was clear that she wanted this new union to work. But I couldn't understand how someone who wasn't blood could fill the space that had once been reserved for my real father. No matter how many holidays we spent together, no matter how many meals we shared around the dinner table, something about him felt foreign to me. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. At first, I tried to win him over the way I might win over a teacher or a friend, by being good, by doing the things that might make him notice me, appreciate me, maybe even like me. I'd make small talk, ask about his day, show interest in the things he cared about, tools, cars, gadgets. But it was as if the more I tried, the more he pulled away. He never really engaged with me the way I hoped, the way I thought a father figure should. His answers were always brief, his attention often elsewhere, as if my presence didn't matter much at all. And there was always this air of superiority about him, a quiet certainty that he was right, that his way of doing things was the only way. It wasn't enough that he simply wanted to live his life his way, he wanted to impose his way of thinking on others, especially me. His advice, when it came, was unsolicited, condescending, and always delivered in a tone that suggested I was beneath him. I'll never forget the first time I felt the full weight of his disapproval. I had been struggling in school, nothing drastic, but I was behind in a few subjects. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table trying to finish an assignment, he appeared in the doorway. His stance was rigid, arms crossed, as if he had been observing me for a while. "You're not even trying," he said bluntly, his words like stones thrown into a still pond. "You're wasting your potential." I looked up surprised, but he didn't give me time to respond. "You could be doing so much better if you just put in some effort." But clearly, that's too much to ask of you, isn't it? The sting of his words cut deeper than I could explain. It wasn't just the criticism of my grades. It was the implication that I was lazy, incapable, someone undeserving of his support. His words painted me as a failure, as someone who could never measure up to his expectations, someone who would always fall short. I tried to brush it off, but inside, a seed of resentment began to take root. Over time, the small cuts of disapproval and emotional distance added up, leaving me feeling more isolated, more misunderstood. He wasn't a father figure to me. He was a distant observer, one who watched from the sidelines, waiting for me to fail so he could say, "I told you so." The years passed, and the gap between us only grew. I couldn't even remember the last time we had a conversation that didn't feel forced. There were holidays, birthdays, and family events that passed with him sitting at the head of the table, offering polite but shallow conversation. He never made an effort to get to know me as a person. Instead, he remained in his fortress of silence, watching from a distance but never engaging. It wasn't just a lack of love or care. It was the way he used his indifference as a weapon. He would make subtle remarks about how I wasn't cut out for certain things, as if everything I did was destined to fail. I couldn't tell if it was his way of protecting me from disappointment, or if he genuinely didn't care. Either way, I felt invisible in his eyes. But I didn't give up. I was determined to earn his respect. I worked harder, I pushed myself, always hoping that one day he would notice. The hope that one day he would say, "I'm proud of you," lingered in the back of my mind like a fragile dream that never quite materialized. I looked for those small, quiet moments when his guard might drop, when he might reveal a softer side. But every time I thought I saw a flicker of warmth, it was immediately extinguished. What made it worse was that my mother never seemed to see it. Or perhaps she chose not to. She had her own reasons for marrying him, her own hopes, and her own dreams for their life together. But in doing so, she had left me to fend for myself in a household where love felt like an obligation, not a gift. She would defend him when I brought up my frustrations, often saying things like, "He's just not good at expressing himself," or "You'll understand when you're older." But I didn't understand. How could I understand a man who treated me like I was nothing more than a temporary fixture in his life? It felt like being an unwelcome guest in my own home. Years passed, and I began to distance myself emotionally from him. I stopped trying to win his approval, stopped looking for validation in his eyes. But the resentment remained, a quiet, smoldering fire that I couldn't extinguish. I had long since given up on the idea of him ever becoming a father to me, but the deep ache of feeling unimportant never fully went away. The story of my stepfather and me wasn't about grand confrontations or violent outbursts. It was about the slow, gradual erosion of a relationship that was never built to last. It was about a constant sense of being overlooked, of trying to fit into a space that wasn't meant for me. I didn't need him to love me, but I needed him to see me, to acknowledge my existence as something more than a nuisance. And in the end, that was the worst kind of rejection. Not the kind that comes with raised voices or harsh words, but the kind that comes with indifference. The kind that leaves you feeling invisible, as if you're living in a world where no one notices whether you rise or fall. In the stillness of those years, I learned an important lesson about myself. I couldn't rely on anyone else's approval to define my worth. My stepfather had never seen me for who I was, but I had to learn to see myself, my strengths, my weaknesses, my potential. I realized that the only person who could fill the void of emotional neglect was me. The revenge I sought wasn't violent, it wasn't loud. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about walking away from the idea that I needed him to validate my existence. It was about showing up for myself, even when no one else did. It had been a long time since I had truly hoped for anything that felt like it could change the course of my life, that could pull me out of the constant cycle of mediocrity I had found myself in. But this was different. This wasn't a fleeting desire or a momentary wish. It was a solid, tangible plan to take control of my future. I was 22, living paycheck to paycheck, and constantly swimming in debt, with no real hope of getting ahead. The world seemed vast and unreachable, a distant horizon that taunted me with its possibilities. But I could see it. I could see the life I wanted, and it was within reach. If only I could break free of the chains holding me back. The loan was the key. It wasn't a large sum of money, just enough to help me pay off some bills, consolidate the mounting interest that was suffocating me, and allow me to start saving for a future I could finally call my own. But there was one thing standing in my way. I needed a co-signer. I couldn't get approved without it. I had a credit score that reflected the mistakes of my younger years, the missteps and miscalculations, but with a co-signer, I could finally break free. I had always known that asking my stepfather for anything was a long shot. I had learned the hard way that he didn't just live by his own rules. He imposed them on everyone around him. His world was rigid, and I was merely a part of the background noise in it. But I had no one else to turn to. My mother was out of the question. She had always been more of a bystander than an advocate. So I found myself standing at the edge of a precipice, looking for a way to leap into a future I could feel proud of. One evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, I decided it was time. I had rehearsed the words in my mind 1,000 times, but each time they felt heavier. The fear of rejection, the discomfort of asking for help, all of it pressed down on me as I made my way to the living room. My stepfather was sitting in his usual chair, the same chair he had claimed years ago, his gaze fixed on the television screen. He never paid much attention to the world around him unless it suited him. But tonight I needed him to see me. "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth. He glanced at me, his eyes momentarily leaving the screen, but only for a second. There was no warmth there, no curiosity, just a blank look of mild acknowledgement. He had already decided I wasn't worth his full attention. "Make it quick," he said, his tone flat. I stood there for a moment, gathering my thoughts, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm trying to get a loan to pay off some bills and get ahead. I need a co-signer," I said, my words coming out in a rush. "I know it's a big ask, but I'm asking you because you're the only one I can turn to." The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. For a long, uncomfortable silence, he didn't respond. He just stared at the TV again, as though I had spoken nothing at all. Finally, he let out a deep sigh. "You really think I'm going to do that?" His voice was laced with disbelief, as though the very idea of helping me was an insult to him. "You think I'm just going to sign on the dotted line for you?" I felt my stomach twist into a tight knot. "Please," I said, my voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I need this. I can't keep going like this. It's not just about the money. It's about me having a chance to build something, to move forward." He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in a long while. But what I saw in his eyes wasn't kindness or concern. It was something much colder, much more dismissive. "You should have thought about that before you put yourself in this position," he said, his words cutting through me like glass. "I'm not going to bail you out just because you want to get ahead. Life doesn't work that way." I had hoped for something else. A moment of empathy, a moment of understanding, or even just a small flicker of recognition that I was trying to do something positive. But all I got was scorn. His rejection wasn't just about the money. It was about me, about my failure in his eyes. He had already decided I was incapable of handling my own life, that I was simply someone who made mistakes and needed to be taught a lesson. I felt the heat of humiliation rise in my chest. How had I allowed myself to believe that he would ever help me? How could I have been so naive, thinking that someone who had never truly cared about me would suddenly step in and save me? "You've got to figure this out on your own," he added, turning back to the television. His dismissal was complete, final. It stung, but it was a familiar sting. It was the same sting I had felt countless times before when I had tried to reach out to him, when I had hoped he might care enough to support me. I left the room without saying another word, retreating into the silence of my own thoughts. The rejection wasn't just about the loan. It was about something deeper, something I had never fully understood until that moment. My stepfather wasn't just refusing to help me with a financial obligation, he was reminding me, once again, of my place in his life. He wasn't just a figure of authority. I was merely an afterthought to him, a nuisance, someone who needed to earn his approval, and never would. But in that moment, something shifted within me. The sting of his words, the bitterness of his rejection, wasn't the end of the story. No, it was the beginning of something else. I had been so focused on seeking his validation, so focused on trying to win his approval, that I had forgotten one important thing. I didn't need him. His refusal wasn't a punishment. It was a gift. In that moment, I understood that I had been looking for approval in all the wrong places. The loan was never about the money. It was about me trying to prove something to someone who would never see me for who I truly was. So I took a step back, and for the first time, I stopped asking for his help. I began to look within, to find the strength I had been searching for in him, but that had always been mine to begin with. I found ways to make ends meet, to build a future on my own terms. I didn't need a co-signer anymore. I had learned to rely on myself, to build my own credit, to save my own money. The loan didn't matter in the end. What mattered was the realization that I could move forward without him. His rejection had not been a barrier. It had been the push I needed to take control of my own life. And in the quiet of that realization, I knew that the greatest revenge wasn't proving him wrong. It was proving to myself that I was capable of standing on my own, without his approval, without his help. I didn't need to be validated by anyone else. I had finally learned to value myself, and that, in the end, was all the reward I would ever need. Keynote 30, the stepfather's reaction. It was a cold evening, the kind where the chill of the air seeps into the bones, and the world outside seems to hold its breath. Inside, the house was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls as the dull hum of the television filled the silence. The moment felt suspended in time, like the pause before a storm. I had just asked my stepfather for something that had been weighing heavily on my mind, the loan co-signing, and his refusal had left a heavy silence in the air. But his answer, though expected, wasn't what I was truly afraid of. What lingered in that quiet room, what I feared more than anything else, was the look in his eyes. For years, I had come to understand his moods, his behavior, and his subtle yet unspoken ways of controlling the environment around him. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or violent outbursts. No, his power was far more insidious, woven into the quiet, everyday interactions that left you feeling smaller than you were. That evening I had hoped that, despite everything, there might be a shred of compassion in him. That somehow, after all these years, he might finally see the person I had become, and maybe, just maybe, offer a moment of kindness. But what I saw instead was something far colder, something that rattled me to my core. "You really think I'm going to help you with this?" His voice was steady, calm almost, but underneath it was something darker, a subtle undercurrent of annoyance, of resentment that had been brewing for years. I stood there, caught between my desire to plead with him, and the reality of how little he had ever cared. "I just need a co-signer. It's the only way I can get approved," I explained, my voice tentative, unsure whether I was speaking to him as a stepfather or as a stranger. "Please, I'm trying to fix my life. I need this." He didn't move, didn't react right away. Instead, he sat there, leaning back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on me as though I were an object he was evaluating, deciding whether or not I was worth his time. I waited for him to say something, but he remained silent, his gaze like an impenetrable wall. That silence stretched on, longer than I could bear. Finally, he sighed, a slow, deliberate exhale that spoke more than any words could. You should have thought about that before you got yourself into this mess. His voice, once neutral, now carried a slight edge of contempt. You think I'm just going to come in and save you from your own mistakes? You think this is how life works? I could feel the sting of his words like a slap across my face. I had asked for help, not to be scolded. But there was something in the way he spoke, something beneath the surface that hinted at a much deeper resentment, something he had been carrying for far longer than I had realized. I never asked you to save me, I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I just thought you might be willing to help. He stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, measured. His gaze never left mine, and for a moment I felt something shift in the air between us, as though the room had grown suddenly darker, heavier. His words were calm, but the venom in them cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. You want help. You want me to help you. You think I owe you that? He shook his head slowly, a mocking smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're nothing but a burden. Always have been. I've never owed you anything, and I never will. His words were sharp, and each one hit its mark with precision. There was no anger in his tone, no shout of fury, just cold, calculated disdain. I felt the familiar rush of humiliation rise within me, threatening to overtake me. How had it come to this? How had I become so invisible in his eyes, so inconsequential, that he could speak to me this way? You've always been a disappointment. He continued, his voice quiet but dripping with contempt. You're never going to be anything more than a failure, and I don't have time to waste on people like you. The words echoed in my mind, louder than they should have been. A failure, a disappointment. I had heard those words before, but never with such weight, such finality. And yet, what truly struck me was not the cruelty in his words, but the deep, unshakable sense of indifference with which he spoke them. To him, I was no more than a passing inconvenience, something to be tolerated, but not truly seen. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, not knowing how to respond, how to make the words that had been festering inside of me for so long spill out. I had wanted to plead with him, to explain myself, to show him that I was more than the mistakes I had made. But in that moment, I realized something important, something that changed everything. I would never get his approval. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I sought his validation, he would always see me as a disappointment. His words weren't just about the loan, they were about me, about my very existence in his life. He had never truly seen me, not as a son, not as someone worthy of respect or love. He had only ever seen me as a reflection of his own frustration, his own dissatisfaction with the world, and I had been so desperate to earn his approval that I had overlooked this fact for far too long. His rejection, his scorn, it was never about the loan. It was about the deeper resentment he had carried toward me for years. I had always been the outsider in his world, the one who didn't fit into the neat little box he had created for himself. And no matter what I did, no matter how much I begged or pleaded, I would always be that person, unwelcome, unwanted, and unworthy of his attention. As he turned away his back to me, I felt the weight of the years that had led to this moment. I had spent so much of my life seeking his approval, seeking his validation, hoping that one day he would see me for who I truly was. But now, in the quiet of that moment, I understood that I would never get what I wanted from him. He was never going to change. I stood there for a long time, the air thick with the sting of his words, the silence of the room pressing down on me. But in that silence, something else began to take shape. I realized that his rejection was not the end of my story. In fact, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I no longer sought approval from someone who would never give it. It was time to stop begging for a place in his world, and instead to carve out my own. The revenge, I would come to realize, wasn't in proving him wrong, in making him see me for who I truly was. The revenge was in freeing myself from the chains of his indifference, in realizing that I didn't need his approval to be worthy. His rejection had, in the end, given me the greatest gift of all, the strength to stand on my own, to stop seeking validation from someone who had no intention of giving it. And in that quiet, dark room, I made a promise to myself I would no longer be defined by his words. I would no longer be the person he had condemned me to be. I would find my own way, on my own terms, and in doing so, I would prove to myself that I was worth more than the empty approval of someone who never truly saw me. In the end, I didn't need his help. I didn't need his validation. I just needed to believe in myself. And that was the greatest revenge of all. The moment of disbelief from my mother, it had been weeks since my stepfather's refusal to sign the loan. Weeks of feeling like I was drowning under the weight of my own financial burdens. Despite everything, despite the cold dismissal from the man who had been part of my life for as long as I could remember, I had tried to move forward, to regain my footing. But I couldn't help feeling like something inside of me had shifted, something I hadn't fully understood yet. The rejection had been hard to bear, but it wasn't the hardest part. No, the hardest part came later, in the moments that followed, when I tried to turn to my mother, to the one person who had always been my anchor in this tumultuous sea. Or so I thought. I had never been particularly close to my mother in the way I imagined others were with their parents. She wasn't emotionally distant, but she had always been more focused on keeping the peace, on maintaining the surface, level harmony of our home, than on truly understanding the complexities of my life. Her focus had always seemed to shift to her own world, her own concerns, and in the midst of it, I had often felt lost. Yet, when I needed someone, I always thought I could count on her. One evening, after another long day spent trying to juggle my finances, I found myself sitting on the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on my chest like a heavy stone. I had done everything I could to make things work, to prove to myself that I wasn't just a collection of mistakes, that I was worthy of something more. And yet, here I was, feeling like I was barely treading water. I needed someone to talk to. I needed someone who would understand. My mother had just finished cleaning up in the kitchen, and as she passed by the living room, I stopped her. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice soft, but carrying a weight of vulnerability I hadn't shown in years. She turned and gave me a gentle smile, one of those smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was the best she could offer. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" I hesitated. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure how to frame it. The words felt too heavy, too real, too raw. Still, I forced myself to speak, to say what had been gnawing at me for so long. I asked him, for the signing on the loan. He said no. And it really hurt, I said, feeling the words come out in a rush. I thought, maybe that after everything he would want to help me. But he didn't, and it makes me feel like I'm not even worth helping. Not even to him. Her expression didn't change at first. She stood there for a moment silent, as if weighing my words. It felt like the longest pause of my life, and for a second, I wondered if she would say something comforting, something that would validate the hurt I was feeling. But when she spoke, her words struck a different chord. "You brought this on yourself," she said, her voice calm, but laced with something that felt almost detached. "You've made choices, and now you have to deal with the consequences. Life doesn't just hand you things because you ask for them. You have to earn them." I blinked, taken aback by her response. It wasn't what I had expected, not by a long shot. I had anticipated empathy, understanding. Something that said she saw me, that she cared about what I was going through. But what I got instead was a cold, clinical dismissal. It wasn't just that she didn't defend me. It was the way she seemed to brush off my pain, as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than the culmination of years of struggle. I stood there for a long moment, unsure how to respond. Her words stung, cutting through me in ways I hadn't expected. "You brought this on yourself." The phrase echoed in my mind, each repetition a reminder of how alone I felt in that moment. It wasn't just about the loan, it was about everything. The years of me trying to gain her approval, the years of hoping for her understanding, only to be met with something so cold, so unemotional that I wondered if I had ever really been seen at all. I felt a wave of frustration, of helplessness. How could she say that? How could she stand there and tell me that I deserved this, that I had somehow caused my own pain? All those years of me trying to make her proud, trying to show her that I was worth something, how could she stand there and say that I was the one to blame for everything? For a moment, I wanted to shout, to argue, to pour out all the hurt that had been building up inside me. But instead, I did the only thing I could think to do. I turned away, retreating to my room, away from her detached gaze, away from the stifling walls of our home that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. I spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The more I thought about her words, the more I realized that this moment, this conversation, was not just about the loan. It was about something deeper, something I had never been able to fully articulate before. My mother had never truly been on my side, at least not in the way I had always hoped. She had never fought for me in the way I thought a mother should. She had always been more concerned with keeping the peace, with keeping things comfortable, than with standing up for what was right. In that moment, I understood that she had never been the anchor I needed. She was a part of my life, yes, But she wasn't the foundation I had longed for. She was just as emotionally distant, just as detached as my stepfather. And that realization was almost as painful as the rejection itself. But, as with everything else, there was a silver lining in this painful moment. What I didn't expect, what I didn't realize in the moment, was that this conversation would become my turning point. This moment of disbelief, this rejection from the one person I had thought would always stand by me, became the catalyst for something more important. Something far greater than I had imagined. Her words didn't define me. The hurt, the rejection, none of it had to determine the person I was becoming. In fact, her refusal to stand by me, her choice to dismiss my pain, gave me the power to stand up for myself. It forced me to look inward, to stop seeking validation from someone who would never offer it, and to start building my own foundation. The real revenge wasn't in proving her wrong. It wasn't about making her see the error of her ways. It was about realizing, in that quiet, painful moment, that I didn't need her approval to move forward. I didn't need anyone's approval. I could stand on my own, I could make my own way, and I could be my own anchor. And in the quiet of my room, in the solitude of that realization, I found peace. Not because I had received the validation I so desperately sought, but because I had finally learned to stop seeking it at all. I would no longer be a passive player in someone else's narrative. I would write my own story, one where my worth came from within, not from the approval of those who never truly saw me. In the end, I didn't need her to defend me. I needed to defend myself. And in that quiet, emotional moment, I found the strength to do just that. The police's reaction to my call for help, the days that followed my conversation with my mother, were difficult. The sting of her words, her lack of empathy, still echoed in my mind. My stepfather's rejection had been sharp and cruel, but it was her indifference that truly broke something inside me. Yet the world had a strange way of forcing me to keep going. Life didn't stop for pain or disappointment. It moved on relentlessly, and I had no choice but to move with it. But there was one moment, one last attempt, that would shape everything for me. It was a day like any other when I found myself facing a crisis that felt bigger than I could handle. I had been drowning in a sea of overdue bills, an unrelenting weight that seemed to suffocate me no matter how many hours I worked. Every day felt like a struggle, every night like an escape from the tension that gripped me. I had tried everything to fix the mess I found myself in, taking on extra shifts, cutting back on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. But nothing seemed to work. The looming pressure was becoming unbearable. The bills piled up. The threats from creditors grew louder. I had reached a breaking point, a place where I could no longer find a way out on my own. And, for a brief moment, I made a decision I would later regret. I called for help. Not just any kind of help. No, in my desperation, I made a decision to call the police. I didn't know what I expected from them. Maybe I thought they could intervene in a way that would push my parents to act, to see the reality of my situation. Maybe I hoped they would take me seriously when my own family hadn't. Perhaps, I thought, the presence of authority would force them to care, to acknowledge the real consequences of my struggle. So I dialed the number, my hands trembling as I pressed the buttons. The words came out in a rush, disjointed and panicked. I need help. I'm being threatened by creditors. I can't handle this anymore. I need someone to talk to, please. The operator's voice was calm, soothing but distant. She asked questions about my situation, about the threats, about my living conditions, and I answered, my mind racing with each question, my heart pounding in my chest. When she asked where I was, I gave her the address, but there was a hesitation in my voice. I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing, but I had already committed, already opened the door to a path I couldn't turn back from. The silence that followed her assurance that officers would be dispatched felt like an eternity. My heart beat in my ears, my thoughts spiraling. What had I done? What was I expecting? But deep down, I had a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point I had been looking for. Maybe the presence of authority would make them see how badly I needed help. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. I felt a jolt of anxiety course through me. I hesitated for just a second, but then I forced myself to walk toward the door. I opened it, and there they were, the officers. Two of them, dressed in their uniforms, their faces unreadable. They asked for my name, my details, and then they stepped inside. The situation, in all its complexity, was laid bare before them. The stress, the bills, the constant threats. And, despite everything, the fear that my own family wouldn't understand. As they listened, one officer turned to me, his expression neutral, almost clinical. "We'll talk to your parents," he said, his tone matter of fact. "But, just so you know, this isn't the sort of thing we typically handle. It's a personal financial issue." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. It wasn't the kind of help I had expected. They were there, but their presence didn't feel like support. It felt like they were just ticking off boxes, treating the situation as something impersonal, detached from the emotions I had been experiencing. When they asked to speak with my mother and stepfather, I led them to the living room where they sat, still engaged in their own lives, unaware of the storm that had just walked through the door. The officers explained what had brought them there, and for a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence. I watched as my stepfather reacted with a slow, deliberate shrug. "I don't know what this is all about," he said, his voice thick with indifference. "She's been fine until now. I don't think we need to get the police involved in our family matters." His words were casual, dismissive, as if this was just another inconvenience to him. To him, I was still the child who had made a mess of things, and this was simply one more problem I had to fix. His eyes didn't show concern, didn't show any remorse for the fact that I had reached out for help. He simply looked at me as though I had done something to disturb his peace. My mother, however, looked up briefly, but her reaction was equally disengaged. "This is just a phase," she muttered, almost to herself. "She'll figure it out eventually. We don't need any more trouble." The officers didn't stay long. After gathering the information they needed, they gave me the same advice they gave anyone in my situation. Speak with a financial counselor, take steps to get things under control, and avoid getting into situations that required police intervention. They offered no real solution, no comfort, and no real action beyond a few words of encouragement. And with that, they left. As the door clicked shut behind them, the room felt colder. The silence was thick, filled with a sense of hopelessness that I couldn't shake. I had called for help, but it hadn't come in the way I had hoped. The police had been professional, yes, but their role was never to care for the emotional weight of what I was going through. They were only there to provide a momentary distraction, to satisfy an impulse that had been driven by desperation. I stood there for a long time after they left, trying to make sense of the emptiness that had filled the space where I had hoped for something different. I hadn't expected them to fix everything, to save me from my troubles, but I had hoped they would see what I had been living with, the strain of years of neglect, the weight of financial instability, the deep isolation I had felt. But in the end, the true lesson came from the silence that followed. The police, my parents, none of them could provide the help I had been searching for. They could offer advice, and they could intervene in legal matters, but when it came down to it, no one could fix what had been broken inside me. That responsibility was mine alone. And it was in that moment, that painful moment of realization, that I understood the real truth. The greatest revenge wasn't in asking for help from others. It wasn't in expecting someone to come in and solve my problems. It was in standing up on my own, taking control of my life, and not relying on anyone else to rescue me. I didn't need the police. I didn't need my parents to change. I needed to change. I needed to stop hoping for someone else to make things right and start taking the necessary steps to build the life I had always dreamed of. In the end, that quiet moment, the one where the police had walked out and left me standing there alone, became my turning point. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about my parents. It was about me. And with that realization, I found the strength to finally move forward, not because anyone else cared, but because I had learned to care for myself. Keynote 6C, the realization of self, worth and moving on the weeks that followed the police intervention, and the emotional withdrawal from both my mother and stepfather felt like a slow, moving current. Time seemed to stretch out before me, heavy and full of reflection, but also with an unexpected sense of clarity. I found myself standing at a crossroads, the weight of everything that had happened, my failed attempts for help, my parents' indifference, and my own internal struggles, still lingering. But through it all, something had shifted within me, something subtle but powerful. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that room months ago, desperate for approval and validation. I was changing, whether I realized it or not, and in that moment, the change felt permanent. It wasn't a dramatic shift, nothing grand or sweeping, but rather a quiet, almost imperceptible understanding that began to take root. My parents had always been my barometer for worth, my measuring stick for success and failure. I had spent so much of my life trying to gain their approval, trying to be what they wanted me to be, that I had lost sight of who I really was. I had become a reflection of their expectations, their judgments, their disapproval. But now, something in me had finally realized that I didn't need to seek their approval anymore. I could stand on my own. I could define my own worth. The first sign of this change came when I decided to stop calling myself a failure. It wasn't something I decided consciously. It was more of a quiet decision made in the depth of my own mind. I had been walking through life carrying that label with me, convinced that it was my only truth. A failure, a disappointment. But in the solitude of my room, in the quiet moments when I allowed myself to reflect, I realized that I had been limiting myself, placing myself in a box created by other people's perceptions. I had defined myself by their standards, by their rejections, and by their inability to see who I truly was. And with that realization came another: I was not defined by their opinions. I was defined by my actions, my resilience, my capacity to keep moving forward despite the setbacks, despite the hurt. I realized that their rejection, whether it was from my stepfather's cold indifference or my mother's detached response, did not have the power to define my worth unless I allowed it to. And in that moment, I chose not to. It wasn't a single moment of triumph, but rather a gradual shift that began to permeate my daily life. I stopped seeking out validation from my parents, and in doing so, I stopped giving them the power they had once held over me. For the first time, I began to make decisions for myself, not based on what they would think or how they would react, but based on what I needed to feel fulfilled, to feel like I was truly living. I started small. I enrolled in a course that I had always been interested in, but had never pursued because I feared their judgment. I reached out to a few old friends who I had distanced myself from, afraid of the awkwardness or the disappointment they might feel in me. Slowly, I built a life outside of the expectations I had so long lived under. And with each step, each small victory, I began to feel something I had never truly felt before: a sense of peace. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It wasn't about showing my parents that I was worthy of their love or trying to make them see me for who I truly was. No, it was about proving to myself that I was enough, just as I was. The only approval I needed was my own. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to my own desires, and to understand that my worth was not tied to anyone else's opinion of me. It was something inherent, something that could not be diminished by rejection or dismissal. But perhaps the most profound change came when I realized that forgiveness was not about excusing the behavior of my parents. It wasn't about erasing the hurt they had caused me or pretending that everything was okay. It was about releasing the hold their actions had on my life. It was about giving myself the space to let go of the bitterness, the anger, and the frustration that had defined my relationship with them for so long. Forgiveness was a gift I gave myself, not them. I didn't need to forgive them for them. I needed to forgive them for me. Because holding on to that anger, that resentment, was only poisoning me. It was keeping me tethered to a past that no longer served me, to a story that wasn't mine to tell anymore. So I let go. Slowly, gently, and with deep, quiet resolve, I forgave them. Not because they had asked for it, or because they deserved it, but because I needed to free myself from the past. With that forgiveness came an unexpected freedom. I felt lighter, as though I had been carrying a heavy burden for years, and finally had the strength to set it down. I didn't need to seek their approval. I didn't need them to see me or understand me. I was whole on my own. I could move forward, not as a shadow of their expectations, but as the person I was meant to be. It was in this quiet release, in this acceptance of myself, that I began to experience something I had never thought possible: peace. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deep and profound. I had spent so many years fighting for something that would never come, my parents' validation, and in the end, I had come to the simple, life-changing truth that I didn't need it. I was enough, just as I was. I had always been enough. As I looked at my life now from the place of calm reflection, I realized that the revenge I had been searching for, those long months of hoping for some form of acknowledgement, some recognition of my struggles, was never going to come. It wasn't about them. It was about me. The real revenge wasn't in them finally understanding or changing. It was in me realizing that I no longer needed them to. The greatest revenge was in living my life on my own terms, by my own standards, and finding fulfillment and peace despite the absence of their approval. And so, with this newfound self-worth, I began to build a future that was mine. A future where I made the rules, where I defined my success, and where I was free from the chains of external validation. It was a slow journey, one that took time and effort, but it was the only path that truly led to happiness. In the quiet of my room, in the stillness of those moments when I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized that I had won, not because I had beaten my parents or because I had proven them wrong. No, the true victory was in freeing myself from the need for their approval, and that, in itself, was the most powerful form of revenge I could ever have imagined. From that day forward, I moved through life, not as someone seeking validation from others, but as someone who knew their worth. And that was enough. Keynote 70, the gradual emergence of strength and independence in the wake of everything, my stepfather's rejection, my mother's indifference, and the fleeting moment of intervention from the police. I found myself standing at the precipice of something new. The lessons had been slow to arrive, hidden beneath the weight of disappointment and pain, but they had come nonetheless. I had learned, in the quietest of ways, that the path forward would not be one where I relied on anyone but myself. It was a hard truth to face, one that took time to digest, but it was the truth I needed to embrace. The shift was subtle at first, as change often is. But over time, I began to see the world, and myself, in a completely different light. At first, it wasn't obvious. I still found myself replaying the moments in my mind, trying to understand the whys and hows of everything that had happened. I would sit on my bed, lost in thought, wondering why I hadn't been enough for them, wondering why I had failed to meet their expectations. But over the weeks, I began to notice something, an unfamiliar feeling that would emerge when I least expected it. It was a feeling that came quietly, like a gentle breeze brushing against my skin, but it was there nonetheless. It was a sense of clarity, a growing understanding that I no longer had to bend to their standards, that their judgments didn't have the power to shape my future. I began to walk differently, more confidently, as though the weight of the world that had once pressed down on my shoulders had lifted, even if just slightly. I wasn't seeking their approval anymore. I wasn't waiting for their validation. The space between us, which had once been filled with expectations and unmet needs, started to grow. And in that space, I found room to breathe, room to grow. One evening, as I sat on the couch in the living room, watching the soft glow of the television flicker across the room, I had an odd, almost surreal realization. I had been so focused on the idea of making it, of proving that I was worthy of love, respect, and care, that I had overlooked the most important thing of all, my own sense of self. I had been striving to fit into a mold that wasn't mine, to meet goals that weren't truly mine, and to live up to expectations that had never truly served me. But that evening, as I watched the rain fall outside, I realized that I was no longer bound to that old story. I could write a new one that was mine, one that was free from the limitations I had so carefully crafted in my mind. I could move on. I could finally be free. The first step in this newfound freedom came when I made a simple, yet profound decision. I stopped looking back. I had spent so much time analyzing my past, dissecting every conversation, every look, every moment of rejection. I had been searching for closure, for an explanation that would somehow make it all make sense. But in that moment, I understood that no amount of analysis, no amount of searching would bring the peace I longed for. The past could not be changed. The only thing I had control over was the present and the direction I chose to move in. So, I chose to stop looking back. It wasn't easy, of course. The memories still lingered, still crept into my thoughts when I least expected them. But when they did, I began to gently remind myself that they didn't have the power to control me anymore. I was no longer that confused, lost person looking for approval. I was someone who had learned to stand on their own, to trust their own instincts, and to accept that their worth didn't come from others. It came from within. As time passed, the changes continued, almost imperceptibly at first, but then with more clarity and purpose. I enrolled in new classes, ones that had always intrigued me but that I had never pursued because of the doubts instilled in me by others. I began to explore new career options, ones that didn't revolve around the old definitions of success that had been imposed on me. I started making decisions based on what I wanted, not on what I thought would make others proud of me. The more I lived for myself, the stronger I became. There was a quiet power that came from knowing that I was capable of standing alone, of navigating the world on my own terms. I no longer felt like a passenger in my own life, waiting for someone else to steer the ship. I was the one at the helm now. But the real test came when I had to face my parents once more. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, nor was it a grand moment of reckoning. No, it was simpler than that, and yet more profound. It was during a family gathering, one of those awkward, obligatory events that we all seemed to attend despite the unspoken tension in the room. My mother and stepfather were there, of course, and I could feel the weight of their gaze on me, as if they were waiting for me to ask for something, to need something. But this time, I didn't need anything from them. As we sat around the table, engaged in idle conversation, I realized something that both surprised and comforted me. I no longer sought their approval. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather a quiet understanding that had grown over time. I was no longer the child who sought to please them. I was an adult now, one who had learned to take responsibility for their own life, their own choices. And in that moment, I felt a deep sense of pride. Not because I had proved them wrong, but because I had finally proven to myself that I was capable of living without their constant validation. My mother glanced at me, as if waiting for me to share some update about my life. But I didn't feel the need to explain myself to her, not in the way I once had. I spoke casually, telling her about the new opportunities I was exploring, the steps I was taking toward my future. And when she asked if I needed help with anything, I responded with a simple, confident no. It wasn't a rejection of her, but rather an acceptance of myself. I didn't need to rely on them anymore. I had learned how to rely on myself. As I walked away from that gathering, I felt lighter. It wasn't the relief of winning some grand battle, nor was it the satisfaction of getting revenge. It was the quiet, powerful feeling of independence, the understanding that I had walked away from their expectations, their judgments, and that I was finally free to be who I truly was. I had emerged from the shadows of their influence, not because I had fought them, but because I had stopped allowing them to define me. In the months that followed, I continued to grow. I found new friendships, new passions, and new opportunities that filled me with a sense of purpose I had never known before. My life was no longer tethered to the past, to their approval, or to their indifference. It was my life now, and I was building it piece by piece. And so, in the quiet solitude of those nights when I reflected on everything that had happened, I came to a simple conclusion: the true revenge wasn't in proving them wrong. It wasn't in waiting for them to change, or seeing them realize their mistakes. The true revenge was in living my life to the fullest, on my own terms, without seeking validation from anyone but myself.